At that time, some Pharisees came up and in order to test Jesus asked, "Is it lawful for a man to divorce his wife?" He answered them, "What did Moses command you?" They said, "Moses allowed a man to write a certificate of divorce and to send her away." And Jesus said to them, "Because of your hardness of heart, he wrote you this commandment. But from the beginning of creation, God made them male and female. Therefore, a man shall leave his father and mother and hold fast to his wife, and the two shall become one flesh. So they are no longer two, but one flesh. What therefore God has joined together, let no one separate." And in the house, the disciples asked him again about this matter. And he said to them, "Whoever divorces his wife and marries another commits adultery against her. And if she divorces her husband and marries another, she commits adultery." The Gospel of the Lord. In the first reading, we heard a rather poetic or perhaps romantic line. Because when God introduces Eve to Adam, he sounds very much like a teenager in love. Because he says, "Aha, at last, this is bone of my bones and flesh of my flesh." It was like saying, "This is the perfect match. This is the one I've been waiting for." Or to use in today's language, my cuddle pot and my snuggle pie. But what we have here is just as blood relations are considered to be flesh and blood, so also now through marriage, there is the starting of this new kind of relationship. They are now so much a part of each other, not apart from each other. And so we have this wonderful teaching that is given to us. Now there is a little line that's thrown in there about the rib, and people sometimes ask me, is that how it really happened? The Bible does not claim to be a medical textbook. And so to ask, is it true, is a misplaced question. Rather, the question is, what truth is this story telling us? And what we have over here, because there are two creation stories. The story that tells us that God is at the heart of all creation, that God creates male and female in God's own image and likeness. There is in both male and female an equality and a dignity, and this is meant to find expression in marriage. And in the very first reading, which Jesus re-echoes actually in the gospel, we have 3 points that I would like very quickly to take you through. Therefore, a man and a woman shall leave father and mother. That's the first point. Second, he holds fast. He clings to his wife or to her husband. And the third, they become one flesh. So what does that really mean? So first of all, to leave father and mother. Can anything be so difficult as to do that? And yet, that seems to be the basis of a marriage. Because we see in some cultures, the married spouse and the wife continue to live with one or the other of their parents. So what does it really mean to leave? It means that with marriage now, there new priorities come into existence. They are established because now the couple, they come first in each other's life. It means, therefore, in case you are still daddy's little girl and mama's little boy, it can never, ever be at the cost of the marriage. On the other hand, you find some who have gone away, but they're not really left. Because the remote control is still there with their parents. Sometimes, even if they are in the same city, across cities, sometimes even across countries. Now, your parents, your children are your children, but they're adult enough to get married. And therefore, it is important now that marriage comes first, and no other loyalty or obligation can interfere with that. You know, the better this is understood and accepted, the marriage will grow, and the relationships with the in-laws will be in its proper place. Having said that, I must put it in context. Husbands and wives, parents have given you the gift of life and also the opportunity to be the kind of person that you are today, the education, the character formation, the opportunities. And what your spouse, for you today is largely a measure due to their love, growth, and influence. So get this clear. To leave father and mother doesn't mean to leave aside, to leave in the lurch, to ignore, to neglect, or to abandon. Not at all. It is a real tragedy sometimes to see a son or a daughter just abandoning, ignoring, or neglecting their parents. Some persons, you could say, go out of the way to make their parents' lives miserable. We find sometimes they put pressure on them to get their share of property. Sometimes they're never satisfied with what has been given to them. And when people do this to their parents, they deprive themselves of their parents' blessing. And sometimes they realize too late when their parents' eyes are closed in death. Let me say this loud and clear. Marriage does not mean that you respect and love your parents less. What it really means is that you respect and love your spouse more. That's the first point. But one just doesn't leave and leaves it hanging in the air. It is so that you cling, you hold fast to. That brings me to the second point. Now, in Hebrew, in the Hebrew language, to cleave, to cling, to hold fast is the sense of being glued together. And to give us a sense of it, it's just imagine two pieces of paper glued and stuck so closely to one another. It has consequences. I'd like to highlight two of them. The first is that if you try to separate these two pieces of paper stuck together, you're going to tear that paper. Husband, wife, and children. The second consequence is because they're glued so closely to each other, nothing else should come in between. Because this is the primary relationship. Not your work, not your profession, not your other friends, not your hobby, not even your parents or children. Rather, this is the primary relationship, and the others find their place around them. If that marriage is really to work. It's a love that holds fast to each other, that speaks about a faithful love, what we call the covenantal love. And this faithfulness is for one's entire life to this person. And that brings me to the third point, to become one flesh. Now, marriage in our Catholic understanding has two important dimensions. The unitive, where you're united, become one flesh, and the procreative. That's out of your love are born children. Just listen to that word. Procreation. God is inviting you to share in his very divine powers of creation. It's born out of that love between husband and wife. And their being united, becoming one flesh, has many and diverse dimensions. For example, you share your bodies, you share your material possessions, you share your hearts, you share your feelings, you share your thoughts, you share your ideas, you share your faith and your God experience with each other. And that's all part of becoming one flesh. Becoming one flesh is not just merely a physical union where you use the other partner as a toy. It's so much more to become one flesh. Now, is it easy? Life tells us, we've all grown up in families, that it's not easy, but one works at it. It just does not happen. When a young couple move in, it's not because they're going to have fun times for the rest of their lives. One works at relationships. They don't just happen. And so we as a community believe that this is possible as a Christian community. A comedian, Sam Levinson, says, love at first sight is easy to explain. But when they've been looking at each other for 40 years or more, that is truly a miracle of love. And we believe in this miracle of love as it has been spelled out, because this is not our journey alone, because part of this journey is Jesus is there to be the glue that holds us together. To abandon Jesus is to lose out an important resource that can sustain and strengthen this marriage. We probably know family and friends who are perhaps so much on this track. The ideal and loving and permanent relationship between man and woman in marriage. Because God intended marriage to be a blessing. And that's why people enter into marriage precisely for that reason. In fact, when God wanted to show his love for us, he used as a symbol, not the priesthood, but marriage. He said the love for God, whether it was in the Old Testament, in the prophet Hosea, or in the New Testament in Ephesians. In fact, the church is seen as the bride, and Christ is the bridegroom. You could say that when God chose to become human, he became one flesh in Jesus with humanity. God entered into our very existence. And that's why we can dare to speak about something as wonderful and as ideal as that. But my friends, the gospel reminds us that there is a gap between the ideal and the real. And this comes up in the gospel in the context of divorce. So this was an issue not only now, but it was even then in the time of Jesus, and if you wish to go back to the time of Moses. And so they come, the Pharisees come, not just to question, but to trap Jesus. Because it's a trap that they're asking him. Because at that time there were two schools of thought. For them, divorce was an existing reality. It was not a matter of if, it was when. And there were two schools. One was, it said, in the case of adultery, it was possible. And the other said, for most frivolous reasons, you didn't cook well enough, maybe you were not pretty enough, you couldn't bear children. And so this whole dimension of, just remember this, in the Jewish society, divorce was the prerogative of the man. The woman had no right. And so if, in the case of a dismissal in divorce, the woman was just thrown onto the street. If her family accepted her back, fine. If not, she had to care for her children. And if you ever wondered why so many times in the Gospels we hear about prostitutes, most likely it was because of women who were abandoned. And so Jesus comes out very strongly protecting the sanctity of marriage so that the vulnerable are not really affected, and that the ideal that is mentioned. In fact, when they refer to Moses, Jesus takes it a notch higher. He goes back to God, his Father himself, to affirm and to remind them of this reality. And we see this today through the movies we watch, through the serials. While some will glorify the values of family life and marriage, others will talk about casual sex or adultery in very glorified terms, which puts even more demands on living faithfully the marriage call today. My sisters and brothers, marriage is of divine origin, but it's lived by two very human persons. Each one of them come with their respective strengths, but they also come with their respective challenges or weaknesses. When there is openness on both sides, then in spite of arguments, bickering, conflicts, disagreements, even fights, if they know that we are in this for the long haul together, then they will seek to make a way out, a way forward, a way in growth. But if people think, well, I got an option, I can just get off, then we won't work at it with the same intensity and commitment. Conflicts arise. And if they're not properly addressed, then you will find both yourself and the marriage crumbling. And for that, as I said earlier, one must work at it. The ability to say sorry, to have patience, to say, could we try again? The ability. And it's not only the duty of one partner. Quite often, it's in a marriage, you will see persons who always expect the other to come and say sorry, to ask for forgiveness, and it's not a mutual respect for each other. The marriage breakdown could happen because of the failure of both, but quite often because of the stubbornness of one who refuses any help. And as a result of this, we see the painful tragedy of sometimes people separated, living apart from their spouse. Some have had a civil divorce and live single. Others have had a civil divorce, found love again and married, but not in the church. Some live in marriages where they are strangers under the same roof, aliens at the table, and unconnected even if they lie on the same marriage bed. Some say we have no problem, but there's no life either. They're like two potatoes in a sack. And therefore, the readings that we have today raise a platform on which we need to speak about some of these issues that we face in society, because these are pastoral issues that a shepherd must care about. There's one element in marriage that I need to speak with force, because it is one of the most disruptive things happening in marriage, and not enough is spoken about. I would call it the ABCs of destruction: abuse, bully, and control. They overlap in different ways. But I'd like first to speak about abuse. Because this abuse, let me put it this way: God has created us in God's own image and likeness. The tragedy is that when one of the spouse tries to create the other in the other's own image and likeness, which is so flawed and sinful, and then that tragedy happens, that you become the abuser, the controller, the one who puts down. And when there's such heartless and ruthless spouse in a marriage, it becomes a living hell for the other. This abuse can be brutal physically, and there are signs to tell: the face, the jaw, terrible. Almost like a monster in the house, and you're supposed to scream quietly lest the neighbors hear. Together with physical abuse, there are other kinds of abuse which may not have physical scarring but can scar you deep within. There is emotional abuse, constantly putting, and here women as well as men can be just as adept at it, because when emotional abuse comes, you mock the other, you put the other down, you treat them in solitary isolation, don't look at their face, refuse to respond to their calls, or there's an absolute cold wall that is put up there. You make them feel like absolutely rotten, and they lose all sense of meaning in life. As I said, not only physical abuse, emotional abuse, control, terrible control. Controlling what they say, what they do, whom they talk, what they do. This is almost a paranoia obsession that we have over there. And then, of course, there's sometimes financial abuse. You control all the finances, so the partner has no way of escaping. You say, it's my money because I've worked for it, forgetting that the spouse has put her career, quite often a woman, on hold, caring for the children, the upbringing, and you have the audacity to say it is my money? And sadly, the victim begins to even believe that. If this marriage is truly meant to be a marriage, then the evil, this violence, this abuse must stop. Quite often, the abuser will abuse, then ask forgiveness. If it's given, goes back to the cycle of abuse again. Such a sick pattern of abuse, such behavior does not just require forgiveness. It needs treatment. It requires therapy, because it puts at risk the life of the partner in the marriage. Such behavior negates all what marriage is all about and what God intended marriage to be. And silence gives courage to the abuser, the controller, the bully, because they think, if nobody knows, I can go on. I'm talking of a terrible pattern of such terrible behavior. Let me say this loud and clear. Abuse and bullying in any form whatsoever is just not acceptable. I want to make it very clear, because breaking the evil, silence, is the first step to exposing the abuse. Talk to your family. Talk to a priest. Talk to a counselor. Talk to a friend whom you can trust. And it is our task to empower the battered and the beaten, the victim, to stand up against the abuse and the perpetrator. But sometimes the family pressurizes them for the sake of the good name of the family. Sometimes they've got no way to go because there is no financial backup at all. Every diocese has a family cell that provides the space and the resource to hear the cry of such painful people in distress. Going forward, what can we do? I'd like to suggest two quick ways. First is a proper preparation for marriage. Now, it's true that before you sign up for marriage in a church, you're expected to go to a 2.5-day preparation. Some people grumble about it, but actually it opens windows. At best, it gives you a way, but 2.5 days is not enough. I took more than 8 to 10 years to become a priest. And some people, however, there is an informal preparation of marriage that's taking place all the time. Because as your children are growing up in your homes and families, they are beginning to see what marriage and family life is all about. The way that the husband treats the wife and the wife treats the husband is already an informal preparation for marriage. So if they see their father as loving, caring, responsible, there for them, if they see their mother as thoughtful, sensitive to the needs of others instead of being self-centered, egomaniacal, narcissistic, then the child will pick up the best that are there in their parents. But if they see the father as one who slaps his wife, the boy thinks that when I get married, that's probably the respectable behavior. The wife, if she's a constant nag, putting people down, talking behind their back, quite often the child is going to grow in that as well, unless they very consciously tear that script and begin to live lives that are authentically suited for marriage. So the first is marriage preparation. The second is, if there are issues in your marriage, have the humility, have the courage, have the honesty to look at it. You know, if I fracture my hand, I go to a doctor because that's fractured. If there is a fractured relationship in your marriage, then have the humility to seek help to address that fractured relationship. Because sometimes there are factors that prevent us from getting help. We think, we fool ourselves. Oh, I can handle this on my own. I don't need others to know my story. Sometimes it's a false sense of shame. Sometimes, knowing there's a problem, living as strangers, they still refuse any help. That is a sick and a serious sign. Now, the church in her wisdom has many things, as I said, pastoral care, but also has wonderful movements. We have, for example, the Christian family movement, a wonderful way they can strengthen marriage. We have what used to be known as Couples for Christ, but Missionary Families for Christ. They have wonderful programs where they meet together in groups. And then we have very consistently over the years, the marriage encounter movement. In fact, they're going to have precisely a weekend at the end of this month, you'll hear later. So there are rich resources to help those in their relationships, for good marriages, for enrichment of marriages, but also for troubled marriages. There is actually going to be an online program called Retrouver, a French word meaning to find again, Retrouvaille. It's a way of helping marriages that are in distress. From 14th to the 17th of this month online, you will find it being conducted. So the church invites you to this marvelous growth. It not only calls you to the ideal, it offers the grace and the strength for it to happen. Grab it. Embrace it. You are meant to live in joy in your marriage. Nobody entered into marriage for the sake of divorce. They entered into marriage to embrace and have that joy. So that, like Adam, you in each one of your marriages will say, aha, at last, this is bone of my bones, flesh of my flesh. May Jesus, who became part of our humanity, give you the grace and the strength to live this sacrament in its depth and in its fullness.